Long before celebrity gossip lived on social media and entertainment news channels ran around the clock, Hollywood's golden age was already drowning in secrets. The glittering world of motion pictures that audiences adored was, behind the scenes, a pressure cooker of hidden affairs, covered-up crimes, and manufactured reputations. Studio bosses ruled their stars like chess pieces, moving them strategically to protect box office profits while burying anything that threatened the carefully constructed image of Hollywood glamour. From suspicious deaths and criminal trials to addiction and exile, the scandals that unfolded between the 1920s and 1950s were often far more dramatic than anything appearing on the silver screen. Here are 20 of the most explosive stories that the industry desperately tried to wipe from the history books. 1. Judy Garland's studio-manufactured addiction. There is perhaps no story more heartbreaking in all of Hollywood history than what was done to Judy Garland in the name of entertainment. The girl who brought Dorothy to life in The Wizard of Oz was pushed into the spotlight as a child, and MGM wasted no time exploiting every ounce of her talent, regardless of the personal cost. Studio production records reveal a deeply troubling practice. Garland was routinely handed stimulants to keep her energetic and camera-ready during long shooting days, then given sleeping pills when the workday ended. This cycle began during her teenage years and planted the seeds of a lifelong dependency on barbiturates and amphetamines. Biographers Gerald Clark and Ann Edwards documented how studio executives went to extraordinary lengths to hide Garland's deteriorating condition. Press releases painted her as a hard-working performer going through temporary exhaustion. Meanwhile, production budgets ballooned on films like Meet Me in St. Louis as her increasingly unpredictable behavior caused costly delays. By the 1950s, MGM's ability to contain the truth was crumbling. Internal communications show frantic efforts to rehabilitate her image, including hastily arranged medical stays and engineered comeback moments. Garland's tragic story would eventually become the most visible symbol of Hollywood's willingness to sacrifice its own stars on the altar of profit. 2. Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle's manslaughter trials, 1921. At the peak of his fame, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was one of the most beloved comedic performers in silent film. Then, over a single Labor Day weekend in 1921, everything collapsed. Arbuckle hosted a party at San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel, where aspiring actress Virginia Rappe fell violently ill. She died days later from a ruptured bladder, and rumors immediately circulated that Arbuckle had sexually assaulted her. Newspapers seized upon the story with little regard for facts. Manslaughter charges were filed, and the studios moved swiftly to distance themselves. 3 separate trials followed. The first 2 ended without verdicts, and the third resulted in a full acquittal. The jury even issued a written statement explicitly declaring Arbuckle's innocence. None of it mattered. Tabloid headlines had already embedded the image of Arbuckle as a moral monster into the American consciousness. Hollywood blacklisted his films entirely, and though the ban was eventually lifted, his career never recovered. His case remains one of the earliest examples of how the Hollywood star machine could turn on its own creations the moment they became a liability. 3. Paul Bern's death and the MGM cover-up, 1932. When MGM producer Paul Byrne, husband of Jean Harlow, was found dead in his Beverly Hills home on September 5, 1932, the studio did not wait for investigators to take control. Byrne had been shot once in the head, and a cryptic note hinted at deep personal unhappiness. What made the case stranger was that Dorothy Millette, Byrne's former common-law wife, reportedly threw herself from a ferry just 2 days later. MGM's legendary fixer, Howard Strickling, was dispatched to the scene within hours, tasked with managing the press and quietly removing potentially damaging evidence. Internal memos show urgent directives focused entirely on protecting Harlow's career and box office value. Investigative journalist Samuel Marks later raised uncomfortable questions in his book Deadly Illusions, pointing out contradictions in staff statements. Neighbors reported hearing 2 gunshots that night, a detail never satisfactorily explained. Harlow said almost nothing publicly, staying firmly within the story the studio had constructed. To this day, the full truth of Paul Byrne's death remains one of Hollywood's most carefully guarded mysteries. 4. Clara Bow and the Gossip Machine, 1920s. Clara Bow was everything the 1920s wanted in a movie star: dazzling, fearless, and impossibly alive on screen. Fan magazines crowned her the ultimate it girl, and audiences couldn't get enough. But the same industry that built her up was simultaneously feeding her to the wolves. Studio publicity departments at Paramount recognized that Bow's wild child reputation was good for ticket sales and had little hesitation about allowing exaggerated stories about her personal life to circulate. The problem was that rumors quickly took on a life of their own. One particularly vicious story claimed she had entertained an entire college football team, a salacious accusation that spread through scandal sheets despite having no credible evidence behind it. According to David Sten's biography, Clara Bow, Runnin' Wild, the actress suffered serious emotional distress under the relentless assault of fabricated stories. Paramount's legal department worked overtime to suppress unauthorized stories, including what appeared to be payments made to disreputable columnists. Bow kept delivering hit films, but her story stands as a clear illustration of how Hollywood's publicity machinery could grind down even its brightest stars. 5. Loretta Young's Hidden Daughter, 1935. Loretta Young was the picture of wholesome Hollywood femininity, deeply religious, carefully composed, and devoted to her public image, which is precisely why what happened during the filming of Call of the Wild in 1935 had to be buried so completely. Young reportedly fell into a romantic relationship with her married co-star Clark Gable and discovered she was pregnant. What followed was an elaborate deception. Young disappeared from public life, claiming she was traveling through Europe. The baby, a girl named Judy Lewis, was born in secret. Young then arranged for the child to be temporarily placed in an orphanage before staging a formal adoption, effectively adopting her own biological daughter to create an acceptable cover story. Key to keeping the secret were powerful gossip columnists Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper, who looked the other way in exchange for access and exclusives. Those close to the situation couldn't help but notice the striking resemblance between Judy Lewis and Clark Gable. Young went to her grave never fully acknowledging what really happened, though Private letters made public after her death hinted at the profound moral conflict she carried for decades. 6. William Desmond Taylor. Hollywood's Unsolved Murder. 1922. The film community woke up to a nightmare in February 1922. William Desmond Taylor, one of Hollywood's most respected directors, had been found shot dead in his Los Angeles bungalow. Police ultimately interviewed more than 300 people, but contradictory witness accounts and tampered evidence made progress nearly impossible. 2 women fell under intense suspicion: actress Mabel Normand, one of Taylor's closest friends, and young star Mary Miles Minter, who was said to have been deeply attached to him. Adding to the intrigue was the discovery that Taylor's personal correspondence had vanished from his home almost immediately, disappearing under circumstances suggesting someone with something to hide had gotten there first. A memoir by silent film actor King Baggett pointed fingers at powerful studio executives who allegedly orchestrated a cover-up. Author Sidney D. Kirkpatrick later revisited the evidence in A Cast of Killers, suggesting motives ranging from romantic jealousy to organized crime connections. No definitive answer has ever emerged. Taylor's murder remains one of the oldest and most persistently discussed unsolved cases in Hollywood history. 7. Mae West. Arrested for obscenity, 1927. Long before Mae West arrived in Hollywood, she was already causing outrage on the New York stage. In 1927, West was starring in and producing a play she had written herself, simply titled Sex. Moral guardians labeled it obscene, and police raided the production, arresting West and her entire cast. Coverage in papers like the New York World described the trial as a circus, with crowds gathering to watch the controversial playwright defend her work. West was fined $500 and sentenced to 10 days in jail, serving 8 after receiving credit for good behavior. Rather than silencing her, the arrest launched her into national fame. When West eventually moved to Hollywood, the battles with censors continued. Internal Paramount correspondence shows repeated clashes with the Production Code Administration over her scripts. Yet films like She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel became massive box office successes. West had discovered something the studios hadn't anticipated. Sometimes the best advertisement a performer could have was a scandal. 8. Joan Crawford's pre-fame secret. Early 1930s. Joan Crawford's journey from chorus line dancer to one of Hollywood's most commanding presences is one of the great reinvention stories in entertainment. But shadowing that transformation was a persistent rumor that before Crawford secured her MGM contract, she had appeared in a pornographic film. Confidential magazine claimed studio bosses had spent considerable sums tracking down and destroying every copy of the alleged footage. Biographer Donald Spoto explored the origins of the story in Possessed, The Life of Joan Crawford, suggesting roots in Crawford's earliest years when she performed in chorus lines and participated in risque publicity stunts. Crawford herself called the claims labelless fabrications. Researchers who have examined MGM's legal archives have found nothing to confirm the rumor. Yet the story never fully died, and in a strange way, it contributed to the air of mystery surrounding Crawford's public persona. It remains a reminder of how rumors, even unproven ones, can permanently shape the way an audience experiences a star. 9. The Errol Flynn Scandal, 1942. Errol Flynn was the kind of star who seemed born to play heroes, dashing, reckless, and magnetic. His performances in Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood made him one of Warner Brothers' most valuable assets. Then, in November 1942, two teenage girls accused him of statutory rape, sending shockwaves through Hollywood. Court documents show Flynn's legal team argued the encounters were consensual and the women had misrepresented their ages. But the specifics were almost secondary to the media frenzy surrounding the case. Columnists Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons turned public curiosity into a full-blown circus. Warner Brothers quietly poured resources into private investigators and high-powered lawyers. Flynn was acquitted in January 1943, with contradictions in the accuser's testimonies proving decisive. Yet the verdict didn't erase what the trial had put into the public imagination. The phrase, "in like Flynn," entered American slang as a permanent reference to the scandal. Flynn went on making films, but the easy, untouchable glamour he had once projected was permanently altered. 10. Robert Mitchum's marijuana bust, 1948. Robert Mitchum built his career playing men who operated in the shadows, cool, dangerous, and indifferent to what respectable society thought. In 1948, he found himself genuinely on the wrong side of the law. Los Angeles narcotics officers raided a Laurel Canyon bungalow and arrested Mitchum alongside actress Lila Leeds. Mugshots of the brooding film noir star landed on front pages everywhere. Mitchum entered a guilty plea expecting leniency, but received 60 days in jail plus probation. He served his time at the Los Angeles County Honor Farm, and even that became a tabloid story when fan mail arrived by the sackful throughout his incarceration. His casual post-release comment, describing jail as like Palm Springs, but without the riffraff, did nothing to reassure anxious studio executives. In a dramatic twist, the conviction was overturned in 1951 after the original arresting officer admitted the bust had been a setup. Mitchum's career survived largely intact. Historians frequently point to his case as a marker of Hollywood's evolving confrontation with drug use and a preview of far more turbulent celebrity scandals to come. 11. Ingrid Bergman's transatlantic scandal, 1949. Ingrid Bergman had achieved something rare in Hollywood. She was genuinely beloved, respected as a serious actress, and admired for moral dignity that seemed to set her apart. Her roles in Casablanca and Gaslight had cemented her status as one of the era's most admired stars. Then came news that shook everything. Bergman, still legally married to Swedish neurosurgeon Petter Lindström, was pregnant with Italian director Roberto Rossellini's child. The reaction in the United States was extraordinary. Congressional records from 1949 include transcripts of U.S. senators denouncing Bergman by name on the Senate floor. RKO. Pictures shelved plans for future productions, and public opinion shifted dramatically against the woman who had seemed untouchable just months earlier. Bergman moved forward anyway, divorcing Lindström and marrying Rossellini, accepting the Hollywood exile that followed. When she eventually returned and won an Academy Award for Anastasia, it felt like a reclamation. But film historians have long argued the scandal permanently altered the trajectory of her career, demonstrating how completely a star's personal life could override even the most impressive professional record. 12. Charlie Chaplin's paternity battle, 1943. By 1943, Charlie Chaplin was one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. That year, a paternity suit filed by actress Joan Barry dragged him through a legal ordeal that exposed just how vulnerable even the most celebrated figures could be. Chaplin denied fathering Barry's child, and blood tests indicated he was not the biological father. Under reasonable interpretation of the evidence, that should have ended it. It didn't. California law at the time rendered blood tests inadmissible, leaving juries to weigh circumstantial details instead of science. Legal historians have noted that Chaplin's openly stated political beliefs, he was a vocal critic of nationalism, may have created a hostile atmosphere that had nothing to do with the actual facts. The jury ruled against him, ordering child support payments for a child science suggested wasn't his. Biographer David Robinson traced a direct line from the controversy to heightened FBI surveillance of Chaplin's activities. In 1952, while traveling in England, U.S. authorities revoked his re-entry permit. He settled in Switzerland and never returned to America. The paternity suit, built on inadmissible evidence and inflamed by political hostility, had effectively ended his life in the country that made him famous. 13. Barbara Payton's collapse, early 1950s. Not every Hollywood scandal ends with a recovery. Barbara Payton's story follows a straight line from bright promise to complete devastation. In the early 1950s, Payton arrived in Hollywood with real screen presence, landing a contract with Universal International. Then her personal life overwhelmed everything else. She became entangled in a violent love triangle with actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal. Police reports from 1951 document the night Neal attacked Tone outside Payton's apartment, leaving him with a shattered cheekbone severe enough to require hospitalization. The Hollywood Reporter turned the brawl into front-page entertainment. Despite it all, Payton tried to hold her career together, even marrying Tone. Within weeks, she was photographed back in Neal's company, and whatever professional goodwill she had preserved evaporated. Studio executives quietly closed their doors. Work dried up. Over the following years, tabloids documented her descent into alcoholism and financial ruin. By the late 1950s, she had fallen into prostitution and homelessness. In her self-published memoir, I Am Not Ashamed, she told her own story with courageous directness. Barbara Payton's story captures something essential and ugly about what Hollywood's machinery could do and failed to do for the people caught inside it. 14. Dorothy Dandridge vs. Confidential Magazine, 1957. Dorothy Dandridge had achieved something genuinely historic. Her Best Actress, Oscar nomination for Carmen Jones, made her the first African-American woman to reach that milestone. Then, in 1957, Confidential magazine ran a story accusing her of improper behavior with white band members in a hotel room. Dandridge fought back, filing a libel suit and engaging celebrity attorney Jerry Giesler. Los Angeles County court records show how her legal team systematically dismantled Confidential's allegations, presenting affidavits that directly contradicted every claim. Giesler emphasized the magazine's pattern of fabricating stories to drive circulation. A settlement was reportedly reached, and the magazine retracted its story. Winning, however, did not mean recovering. As Dandridge described in a 1958 Ebony magazine interview, the emotional toll was enormous. Studios remained cautious about investing in black performers under the best circumstances. Adding the complication of tabloid controversy made executives even more reluctant. The confidential lawsuit revealed something ugly and persistent. That vindication on paper did not translate into a fair shot in practice, particularly for performers facing both racial prejudice and scandal journalism simultaneously. 15. Tallulah Bankhead's Defiant Life, 1930s to 1940s. Tallulah Bankhead came from political royalty, but spent her entire adult life happily dismantling every expectation that background implied. On stage and screen, she was mesmerizing, earning genuine critical respect for performances in films like Lifeboat. But it was her open and unapologetic bisexuality that made the studios deeply nervous. Gossip publications hinted at her relationships with both men and women throughout the 1930s. Memos preserved in the Paramount archives show producers actively pressuring Bankhead to maintain a more conservative public persona, worried that her lifestyle would generate the wrong kind of headlines. Bankhead largely ignored them. On radio programs and in interviews, she tackled topics other performers wouldn't touch, famously describing herself as ambisextrous, a quip that writers like Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams repeated admiringly for years. By the 1940s, certain directors had become reluctant to cast her in major roles, citing concerns about religious group backlash. She continued performing regardless, building a legacy that went far beyond what any studio's damage control department could manage. Tallulah Bankhead represents something specific and important, a person who refused to be erased even when everything around her conspired toward that end. 16. Jean Harlow's Troubled Marriage, 1932. Jean Harlow's on-screen persona radiated supercharged confidence, electric, provocative, and entirely in command. The reality of her private life in 1932 was almost unbearably different. When Harlow married MGM executive Paul Byrne in July of that year, the studio publicity machine immediately began crafting the narrative of a perfect Hollywood romance. Private correspondence among MGM insiders, examined by biographer David Sten, tells a darker story. Some accounts suggest Byrne struggled with serious personal difficulties that produced controlling and volatile behavior toward Harlow. Friends said she had confided in them about the situation, but MGM's publicity apparatus ensured none of those conversations became public. The marriage lasted barely 2 months before Byrne was found dead under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Despite everything, Harlow kept working and delivering performances that audiences loved. But the whispered stories about what her brief marriage had actually looked like left a shadow over her public image that never entirely lifted. The Harlow-Byrne marriage stands as one of the most troubling examples of how completely the studio system could paper over the private suffering of the people it controlled. 17. Ramon Novarro's Murder, 1968. Ramon Novarro's greatest fame belonged to the silent film era, when his performance in Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ made him an international star. When sound pictures transformed the industry, his career gradually faded and he retreated into private life. Then, on October 30th, 1968, that quiet was shattered violently. Navarro was found dead in his North Hollywood home, the victim of a brutal attack. Two brothers, Paul and Tom Ferguson, were charged with torturing and killing Navarro, allegedly believing he kept large amounts of cash at the residence. Much of the tabloid press seemed more interested in details of Navarro's private life, specifically his homosexuality, than in the straightforward criminal facts. Both brothers were convicted and received lengthy prison sentences. What lingered long after the trial was how the coverage had handled Navarro's story, more fascinated by the victim's sexuality than by the crime itself. Film historians noted how the manner of his death overshadowed his considerable cinematic legacy, reducing a genuinely talented performer to a footnote defined by tragedy. The Navarro case remains a stark illustration of Hollywood's fraught and hypocritical relationship with homosexuality. 18. Marilyn Monroe and the Rumors That Never Died. Marilyn Monroe understood better than almost anyone how to construct and control an image. Throughout the 1950s, publications like Confidential and Silver Screen fed their readerships steady speculation about Monroe's romantic connections. From her marriage to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio in 1954, to alleged affairs with President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert. Evidence for any Kennedy affair has always been circumstantial. Personal notes, second-hand accounts, the kind of material that fuels theories rather than settles them. What changed everything was Monroe's death in 1962, which transformed existing gossip into full-blown conspiracy theories, suggesting powerful political interests had played a role. FBI files, partially released in the late 1980s, confirmed she had been under surveillance due to leftist associations, though nothing confirmed any presidential romance. At 20th Century Fox, executives were watching nervously throughout this period, particularly during the troubled production of Something's Got to Give, Monroe's final, unfinished film. Internal memos expressed concern that ongoing negative press could kill any chance of a successful comeback. Whatever the truth of her private life, Monroe's enduring legacy as a symbol of Hollywood's beauty and its cruelty has outlasted every rumor attached to her name. 19. Howard Hughes, Genius, Obsession, and Control, 1930s to 1960s. Howard Hughes occupied a space in Hollywood that no one else came close to filling. Wealthy enough to do whatever he wanted, connected enough to open any door, and strange enough to make everyone around him deeply uncomfortable. His romantic relationships with major stars, including Katharine Hepburn and Ava Gardner, were documented in studio gossip logs, with persistent talk about how Hughes used his money to keep relationships on his own terms. His approach to filmmaking was equally controlling. The outlaw triggered an extended battle with censorship bodies over Jane Russell's wardrobe. Biographers documented how Hughes's obsessive tendencies grew increasingly pronounced over time. Compulsive behaviors, months spent locked inside darkened screening rooms, an inability to stop washing his hands. By the 1950s, Hughes had essentially withdrawn from public life, conducting his business empire from a sealed penthouse at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, where he had taken over the upper floors and refused to leave. He died in 1976, a frail and isolated figure far removed from the powerful personality who had once commanded Hollywood's attention. Hughes's story is ultimately about the strange intersection of brilliance and disorder, and how enough money can allow a person to construct an entirely private reality. 20. Elizabeth Taylor, Eddie Fisher, and the End of Innocent Gossip, 1958. By 1958, Elizabeth Taylor was a genuine movie star in every sense. Her performance in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof drawing both critical praise and box office success. Then her third husband, producer Mike Todd, was killed in a plane crash, and everything that followed became one of the defining celebrity stories of the decade. In her grief, Taylor grew close to Todd's best friend, Eddie Fisher, who was married to beloved star Debbie Reynolds. When the relationship became public, tabloids branded Taylor a homewrecker and Fisher a faithless husband. Audiences took sides overwhelmingly in Reynolds' favor. Fisher watched his record sales slide and his television sponsors quietly disappear. Taylor married Fisher in 1959, but that chapter closed quickly when she walked away for actor Richard Burton during the production of Cleopatra, launching yet another wave of scandal. Taylor continued to work brilliantly throughout, her professional achievements essentially immune to the surrounding chaos. Fisher never recovered the same popularity he had enjoyed before the affair. Film historians have identified this episode as a turning point, the moment when Hollywood gossip stopped being a relatively contained game played between studios and columnists and began its evolution into the wall-to-wall spectacle that defines celebrity culture today. These 20 stories remind us that glamour has always had a shadow side. The golden era of Hollywood produced extraordinary art and extraordinary excess in roughly equal measure, and the studios that controlled both were always more interested in protecting their investments than in protecting the people who made those investments possible. The scandals they buried tell us as much about that world as the films they put on screen.